Hi guys, I wanted to hop on, and today we are going to go over the work that you did yesterday. After looking at how you guys performed on that assignment, I realized that you guys really were not able to use your notes in a way that was helpful to you in order to answer those questions. So I wanted to kind of walk through some of those questions with you and help you understand that food webs can be really different depending on where it's from and what organisms are in what order. So I thought I would start with just this particular food web. And you can see down here at the bottom, we start out with all of these producers. Producers are not consumers. Okay, a lot of you guys kept trying to say that these were primary consumers. Consumers have to eat to survive. Plants do not eat to survive, right? Plants use energy from the sun, captured in potential energy that's stored in its fruit, its flowers, its stems, its leaves. Okay, so if we look at the corn right here, what would be a primary consumer that eats corn? Well, the grasshopper is a primary consumer. What are the other primary consumers listed here? Well, butterflies also eat plants, and fruit flies eat plants. Those are the only primary consumers. Okay? These are primary. Okay? Primary consumers. These are our producers down here. This is our first level of consumer. Okay? Now, if a fruit fly gets eaten by, I can't find my pointer. There we go. If a fruit fly gets eaten by a thrush, a bird, right? This is a secondary consumer. Okay? If a fruit fly gets eaten by a dragonfly, that is a secondary consumer. If a fruit fly gets eaten by a frog, that is a secondary consumer. Now let's look at our butterfly. Our butterfly can get eaten by a dragonfly. Our butterfly can get eaten by a frog. Our grasshopper can get eaten by a frog. That's our secondary consumer. Grasshopper can get eaten by a rat. That also is a secondary consumer. So all the ones that are orange are secondary consumers. Okay? Let's change to another color. Okay? So let's keep going. We start with our producer. We've got our fruit fly. Our fruit fly gets eaten by our dragonfly. Our dragonfly gets eaten by a thrush. Oh, Miss Young, you already circled that. Yes, organisms can be secondary consumers in one food chain and tertiary consumers in another. Okay, a fruit fly gets eaten by a dragonfly. The dragonfly gets eaten by a frog. Also, tertiary consumer. Okay, can the fruit fly still get eaten by the frog? Yeah, but the dragonfly can also get eaten by the frog. So that makes the frog a tertiary consumer in this food chain. Remember, a food chain has only one organism at each step. Okay. Let's look at our butterfly. We've got our butterfly gets eaten by our frog. The frog gets eaten by the python, right? So can we have tertiary consumers that are farther up? Yeah. Butterfly gets eaten by the dragonfly. Dragonfly gets eaten by the frog, right? Grasshopper gets eaten by the frog. We already got him. Grasshopper gets eaten by the rat, and the rat gets eaten by the eagle. Got another tertiary consumer. All of our blues are tertiary consumers. That is the third consumer, right? 3. There's 1, 2, 3 in that list. Primary consumers are 1s. Secondary consumers are 2s. Now, you saw the word quaternary consumer in your food web as well, right? Quaternary consumers are the 4th consumer. So if I start over here again with my fruit fly, let me swap colors one more time. If I start over here with my fruit fly, this is primary consumer. This is my first. Dragonfly is my second. Frog is my third. But what eats the frog? Oh, python. He can also be a quaternary consumer, right? What else eats the frog? The eagle. He can be a quaternary consumer, okay? What about if I go over here to my rat? I've got my primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Eagle can be a tertiary consumer. Also, the wolf can be a tertiary consumer. So do you guys see how it's not just one thing? It's based on the order in which it falls in the chain, because a food web, remember, is overlapping chains, okay? So let's look at the questions from yesterday. Number 1, which organism is a decomposer? Remember, decomposers are going to eat dead organisms. Only one is a decomposer. That is our worm, right? So that is number 1. Number 2, which 6 organisms are secondary consumers? Okay, so this is number 2, which 6 organisms are secondary? This means that they are the second consumer. This does not include plants. Plants are not consumers. Plants are producers. So what are going to be our secondary consumers? That's going to be the second consumer in a chain. So if we start with plants, that's our producer. 1, this is our first consumer, our primary consumer. This is our secondary. So you should have had frog. We're going to start back at our plants. This is our first consumer, squirrel. Second consumer, fox. First consumer, squirrel, right? They eat the plants. Squirrel gets eaten by the owl. There's 3. We're looking for 6, right? Start back at our plants. We go up to mouse. What does mouse get eaten by? An owl and a fox. Go back to plants. Bird, that's our primary consumer. So our secondary is going to be our cougar and our eagle, right? We go back to plants. We go to grasshopper. That's our primary consumer. And so the bird is our 6th secondary consumer. So those 6 should have been what you got for number 2. Number 3, let's switch to another color. How many, oops, that's the same one I used for the other one. Let's try again. Number 3, how many food chains is the grasshopper a part of? Okay, so if we find the grasshopper here, okay, this is the first step in that food chain, plants, right? Here's the second step, third, and 4th. That's 1 food chain. Remember, we only have 1 thing at each level. So if we start back at plants, we're making a second food chain. 1, we got grasshopper as our first, then bird, then cougar, right? That's our second. Now we have 1 more. We go back to plants, grasshopper, bird, owl, and cougar. That's our third, right? So we have 3 different food chains that make up, that use the grasshopper in some way, right? So this should have been number 3, okay? How many food chains is the mouse a part of? Okay, so if I come down here, I already used that color. Yeah. Purple. How many food chains is the mouse a part of, right? So same thing. We're going to start back down here. We've got our plants. We've got our mouse. We've got our owl. We've got our cougar. That's 1. We've got our plants. We've got our mouse. We've got our fox. We've got our cougar. That's 2. Do we have any other ways that we can follow our arrow? No. So this one should have been 2. Okay. Do you guys see how you've got to follow each chain in the web to get the information that you need? All right. Here's 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay. What would be worse for this food web? The removal of the cougar or the plants, and why? Well, let's look at the cougar. Okay. We've got the cougar that eats birds, rabbits, owls, foxes. That's a lot of things that it eats, but does anything eat it? It doesn't really have a predator. No arrows are going away from it. Now let's look at plants. Everything on the food web depends on plants. So if we took the plants out, all of these other things above the food chain would die, right? They wouldn't have a food source. So plants, because everything depends on plants in this food web. Number 6, which one organism is both a primary and a secondary consumer? Remember, from the first slide, I showed you guys that organisms can be both primary and secondary. So if we look at the butterfly here, it is only primary, right? It doesn't have any other arrows that show me that it can be something else, okay? So let's look at all of our primaries because it must be a primary consumer. So I've only got one arrow going to the butterfly and one going away. So that one is not going to work. What about the squirrel? Same thing. One arrow is going to it. Have two arrows going away. It doesn't have another arrow coming to it. It doesn't have another food source. Mouse only eats plants, so it's not a secondary consumer. Secondary consumers have to eat animals. What about the bird? We've got the bird that eats plants, and the bird also has two other arrows. It's got grasshoppers and it eats worms. So in this chain, this is our producer step. It's a primary consumer of grass. It's also a secondary consumer because the grasshopper is a primary consumer in this chain from plants to grasshopper to bird. So grasshopper is primary, which means that bird is also secondary. So this one should have been, number 6 should be bird. Ooh, Miss Young's got beautiful handwriting on here. Okay, number 7. Which organism in the food web is the producer? This one should have been easy, guys. We went over this in our notes. The producer is the plants. Plants produce their own energy from the sun. Which two organisms, number 8, are top carnivores? That means nothing else preys on them. Nothing else. Well, let's look towards the top because we know they're going to be towards the top. So we're following the arrows all the way until they stop. Okay, so if you follow the arrows up to the snake, does the snake have any arrows away from it? Yeah, the fox still eats it. Does the fox get eaten by anything? Yeah, the fox gets eaten by the cougar. What eats the cougar? Nothing. So is that going to be one of our answers? Yes, cougar is one of your correct answers. What's the other one that doesn't get eaten by anything? Cougar, and what about the owl? Oh, owl gets eaten by the cougar. What about the eagle? Eagle does not get eaten by anything. So this one should have been eagle and cougar for number 8. Number 9, which 5 organisms are tertiary consumers? This means this word, when you see tertiary, should make you think this is the third animal. Okay, if you need to add that to your notes, do it. This is the third animal. Love this writing. Okay, so this is the third animal in a food chain. So we're starting off with plants. Butterflies are number 1. Frog is number 2. Snake is number 3. There's 1. Butterfly is number 1. Frog is number 2. Fox is number 3. There's 2. Butterfly is number 1. Frog is number 2. Owl is number 3. Okay, that's all the ones that go away from frogs, all the arrows. Now we're going to start back at our producer. This is our squirrel. This is our primary. Now our fox is our secondary. And our cougar is our tertiary, our third, right? Primary squirrel. Secondary. Do we have any more arrows that go away from the cougar? From the owl? We've already got the cougar, right? So then we're going to come back down to the plants. Mouse, fox, cougar, right? Cougar's the third one. 1, 2, 3. To the cougar, still no. When we start from the bird is primary, cougar is secondary, bird is primary, eagle is secondary. We're looking for tertiary consumers. So we start with our plants. We go to the rabbit. That's 1. We go to the owl. That's 2. We go to cougar. That's 3. Okay, can't find anything else on that one. We still need 1 more tertiary consumer. Start at plants, go to grasshopper. That's primary. Bird is secondary, which means that the eagle is also tertiary. Okay, so you should have had snake, fox, owl, cougar, eagle for tertiary consumers. How many food chains is the frog a part of? Okay, well, let's look at, let me change colors. Let's look at our frog. Okay, so we always have to start our food chain with a producer, right? Our producer, then butterfly, then frog. And then it splits off 1, 2, 3 ways, right? So let's go 1, This is our producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, top predator, quaternary consumer. Okay, so that's one food chain. Okay, where'd my little marker go? One. Now I'll start at the bottom again. Producer, butterfly, frog, fox, cougar. That's number 2. Just going to keep little tally marks. Plants, butterfly, frog, snake, fox, cougar. That's 3, right? That's 3 different food chains, that the frog is a part of. Number 11, what would be worse for this food web? The removal of the eagle or the owl, and why? So if we look at the eagle up here, we can see that it eats birds, but it does not get eaten by anything. If we look at the owl here, we can see that it eats rabbits and birds and mice and squirrels and frogs. So it eats a big variety of different foods. And it also gets eaten by something. So it has more things that it eats, and it gets eaten by more. So the owl should have been the correct answer for number 11. Okay, the owl was the right one for number 11. What would be the worst for this food web, the removal of the cougar or the eagle, and why? The cougar, all the way at the top, and then the eagle up here. Well, neither one of them have predators that eat them. Which one has more prey that they consume? And so the eagle has just the one, birds, by looking at this food web. And the cougar eats birds and rabbits and owls and foxes. So is it going to have a bigger impact on these populations of the foods that it eats? Yes. So the cougar would be the correct answer here because it's going to impact all these different organisms that it eats, right? There's going to be more of those because there isn't a cougar. That makes sense? All right. 13, name 2 organisms that are both secondary, the second consumer, and the tertiary, the third consumer in a chain. Okay, so if we come over here, we've got butterfly. Well, we start with our producer. Then we've got butterfly, that's our primary, and frog is our secondary. Okay, is the frog going to be a tertiary consumer? Does it have any other arrows that go to it? No. Okay, so let's come down here and let's look at the squirrel. Squirrel is a primary. The fox is secondary. Can the fox also be a tertiary consumer? Well, if we go primary butterfly, secondary frog, tertiary fox, this would be a tertiary consumer. And it's also secondary if you follow the producer from the plant, and the energy goes to the squirrel, and then the energy goes to the fox, the secondary consumer. So the one of these could have been the fox. I guess I could just circle them. Okay, let's look and see if we can find another one. What about if we look at let's look at the owl, right? So we've got producer, primary consumer is the squirrel, secondary consumer is the owl. Okay, so it's a secondary consumer. Let's see if it's a tertiary consumer because it's got lots of arrows going to it. Well, it's not a tertiary consumer from the mouse. It's not a tertiary consumer from the rabbit. But we've got a primary consumer here, the grasshopper, secondary consumer here, the bird, and a tertiary consumer here, the owl. So are the fox and the owl both tertiary consumers? Yes. Are those the only 2? Guess what? But wait, there's more. Okay. So if we look at the worm as a food source or the grasshopper as a food source, we've got the grasshopper is our primary consumer, the bird is our secondary consumer, and the eagle is our tertiary consumer. Well, it's also going to be if the bird eats producer, it's primary consumer, and then the eagle is also a tertiary consumer. So there's 3. There's actually 4 in this, food web that are both secondary and tertiary consumers. The cougar is the last one because it's the rabbit is the primary consumer, so the cougar would be secondary. And then if it was coming from the mouse, that's mouse is primary. The owl is secondary, which makes the cougar also tertiary, right? So it can be more than one thing depending on the food chain that you're following, okay? Which organism in the food web is an omnivore? Omnivore. That means they eat both plants and animals. There's only one, and that one was the bird. The bird eats grasshoppers and worms, which are both animals, and it also eats plants, right? Which makes it an omnivore. Okay, which 6 organisms are primary consumers? Primary consumers eat plants. They are not plants, they eat plants. So, butterflies, look at the arrows from the plants, right? So, butterflies, 1. Squirrel, 2. Follow the arrows. Mouse, 3. Bird, 4. Rabbit, 5. And grasshopper, 6. Okay. Which 2 organisms are quaternary consumers? This is the 4th level. These eat tertiary consumers. Okay. So if we look at our food web here, right? Again, we're starting with our producer. First consumer, second consumer, right? First consumer, butterfly. Second consumer, frog. Third consumer, snake. Fourth consumer, fox. Is that a quaternary consumer? Yes. Start again. Producer, primary consumer, butterfly. Secondary consumer, frog. Tertiary consumer, owl. Quaternary consumer, cougar, right? Those are 2 organisms that are quaternary consumers, okay? All right, 17, 18, 19, and 20. How many food chains is the snake a part of? Again, you've got to follow the arrows. If we start down here with producers, then butterflies, frogs, snakes, foxes, cougars, that's 1. Start down here at producer, butterfly, frog, snake. Ooh, look at that. Snake is only a part of 1, right? Because once you get to frog, you have to go to snake. That's the only way that it gets eaten. The snake only eats the frog, and then it goes on to the next stage. What would be worse for this food web, the removal of the worm or the snake, and why? Well, if we took out the worm, what's going to process all the dead plant and animal matter? And remember, all of these things can die. Everything in this food web can become this detritus, this dead plant and animal matter. So the worm needs to break it down so that those nutrients can be recycled into this system. So obviously the worm would be the worst because then there's nothing to return nutrients to the food web. What would be worse for this food web, the removal of the mouse or the squirrel, and why? Well, let's look at the mouse. What does the mouse eat? The mouse eats plants, and the mouse gets eaten by owls and foxes. Same thing with the squirrel. The squirrel eats plants. The squirrel gets eaten by owls and foxes. So their impact is exactly the same in this food web because they eat the same things and they get eaten by the same things. All right, so we're going to look at number 20, right? Name 1 organism that is both a tertiary and a quaternary consumer. So we're looking for an organism that's number 3. Tertiary should make us think 3rd consumer, and a quaternary consumer, that should make us think 4th consumer. So if we look over here, let's see, butterfly, frog, fox. Fox is our 3rd, our tertiary consumer, okay? Now, is it also a quaternary consumer? Well, we've got butterfly, we've got frog, we've got snake, and then we've got fox. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that also a quaternary consumer? Yes. So fox would be the correct response for number 20. There actually were 4 other questions that I didn't include on your online questions that I thought might help you just to be able to dig into this information a little bit more. Number 21 said, which organisms are carnivores? So carnivores are going to be organisms, remember, that only eat meat. So are we going to have any primary consumers be carnivores? No, we're going to be looking at organisms like the frog. Frog does not eat any plants. It only eats butterflies, right? Its arrows only coming from the butterfly. What eats the squirrel? Well, we've got foxes. They don't eat any plants. And we've got owls. They don't eat any plants. What about a mouse? Oh, mouse eats plants. We've got to follow those arrows backwards. What about a rabbit? A rabbit eats plants. What eats the rabbit? Rabbit gets eaten by a cougar. That's going to also be a carnivore, right? Based on the information we have in our food web. What about our snake? What does it eat? It eats frogs, and it gets eaten by foxes. It is also a carnivore. What about our eagle? Our eagle only eats birds, so it's going to be also a carnivore. What about our bird? Our bird eats worms and grasshoppers, and if we follow our arrow back, plants. So is a bird going to be a carnivore? No, it's not a carnivore, so we're not going to include that one in our choices. Did we find all of the carnivores here in our web? Yes. Now, which organisms are herbivores? Herbivores are going to be organisms that eat only producers, only plants. So if we're looking for our herbivores, they're going to be things that are primary consumers. So butterfly, squirrel, follow your arrows from your producer, right? Follow it up, mouse. Go back to your plants. Is a bird herbivore? No, because they eat grasshoppers too, so we can't include them. Rabbit is an herbivore. And a grasshopper is an herbivore. Why don't we include the worm? The worm is special. Remember, the worm is our decomposer, okay? All right, which organisms contribute to the detritus? Now, detritus means dead plant and animal matter. So, are all of these organisms going to die at some point, right? Does grass die? Sure. Do butterflies die? Yeah. Foxes? Mm-hmm. Birds die? All of these things die, which means eventually they're all going to wind up as dead plant or animal matter. So which organisms contribute to the detritus? All of them, right? And the last question, if the frog was removed from the food web, which organism would suffer the most and why? So we've got our frog over here, right? And it gets eaten by snakes, it gets eaten by foxes, it gets eaten by owls, and it eats butterflies, right? So who's not going to eat if frogs disappear? Do foxes have another way to eat? They eat squirrels too. Do owls have another way to eat? Oh, they eat like a little bit of everything, right? They've got lots of choices. What about a snake? Is a snake going to be able to eat according to this food web if the frog is removed? No. So the snake is going to be the one that's going to suffer the most, because if it's removed from this food web, the snake isn't going to have a food source, right? Based on the information shown here. So I hope that helps you guys understand a little bit about how some of those questions that you got wrong were incorrect. And I'd like you to go back and look at your responses and try to fix them based on the information that we've gone over today. So you have So I'd like you to go and look at today's assignment after you watch this video and see if you complete the questions that are on food webs and chains a little bit more efficiently today. So I hope you have a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow for Face to Face Friday.